Amendment 16.
Thank you, Chair. We have tabled 13 amendments, not to frustrate the bill, but to give it the teeth that it needs. This is a bill that is soft where it should be hard, silent where it should speak, and blind where it should see. Soft because, as drafted, it sets a higher bar to prosecute a person who supports the IRGC than a person who supports the terrorists the IRGC funds and commands. Silent because whole categories of hostile conduct that our terrorism law has criminalised for 20 years are simply missing. And blind because it has been written for one organisation on one timetable with almost no provision for future designations. Goodwill is not enough, and we must close the holes our enemies will exploit. The government has lifted much of this legislation from Section 12 of the Terrorism Act 2000, yet it has added something that does not appear in the terrorism offence: a requirement that the support be given for a prohibited purpose, a purpose prejudicial to the safety or interest of the United Kingdom. So let me ask the Minister the simple question this bill invites. What level of support for the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps does this government consider beneficial to the United Kingdom? Because the IRGC is the world's largest state sponsor of terrorism, and if the Right Honourable Lady agrees that there is none, then we can simply remove the prohibited purpose, as she has just said from the front bench that she agrees that there is absolutely none. Then let's act and change it. Because as drafted, to convict someone who supports the IRGC, the prosecution must also prove an additional threshold that that support was prejudicial to the safety or the interests of the UK. That does not exist in terrorism law. So to convict someone who supports Hamas or Hezbollah or the Houthis, the proxies the IRGC arms and funds, there is no such hurdle. So the body that inspires, organises, arms, funds the terrorists is handed a protection in law that the terrorist himself is denied. And this is the difference between a prosecution that succeeds and one that never gets off the ground. And I know something about prosecutions failed at the last moment. Our Amendment 3 simply removes the extra defence and brings this offence into line with the terrorism law that it's drawn from. Now, I recognise the government may seek to argue that the state entities enjoy protections in international law that terrorists do not, that we must set a higher bar than equivalent terrorism legislation, and acting prejudicially to the UK's interest is a reasonable test. But state immunity protects the Iranian state from being sued or prosecuted in our courts, and it has nothing to do with the British resident who chooses to fund or promote the IRGC. We are not prosecuting Tehran. We are prosecuting the person here who does their work, and the proposition the Minister is left defending is that the world's biggest sponsor of terrorism should be harder to prosecute than the supporting groups it sponsors. That is not a higher bar. It is international lawyers tying the hands of ministers meant to be keeping us safe. Turning now to Amendments 11 and 12. The same instinct to protect where we should prosecute runs through subsection 7, which makes reasonable excuse a defence for accepting and keeping a material benefit from a designated body. But it's not necessary, because we already have protections in the bill if you are, for example, a lawyer or somebody who had no ability to know that there may be funds you are taking. It is in the National Security Act, I recognise that. But it is not a reason to repeat a weakness. We have an opportunity to fix it. And there is no excuse for keeping a hostile state's money, not in this bill and not in the Act it leans on. Then there is the sentencing, which gets the gravity backwards. As drafted, supporting a designated body and actively assisting one carries the same maximum sentence, 14 years or a fine. Very happily give way to the right.
Before she moves on to fines, this issue, the one she has just raised and I raised earlier, seems to be crucial. It is true that Jonathan Hall, as the Minister said when we were in the second reading debate, Madam Chairman, recognised the approach to a terrorist organisation was different to the approach to a state. Nevertheless, by creating this higher bar, whereby to secure a successful prosecution, the individual concerned must be established that the individual concerned was acting on behalf of a designated body for a prohibited purpose. So the connection between the body is not sufficient. Seems to me to make prosecution less likely rather than more likely. Now, if it's international law that's the heart of that, and they fear appeals and so on and so forth, we need to hear that from the Minister, and it needs to be a highly persuasive case. Because to me, it seems to me the government are making their lives more difficult rather than easier.
I thank my right honourable friend, and that is exactly the crux of the point that I made in my earlier speech in the earlier readings. We cannot set a higher threshold because we will see convictions collapse, or prosecutions, collapse for exactly that reason. We need to be arming prosecutors to go and get the justice that our country needs to better protect us. Precisely. Turning back to the maximum sentence of 14 years, actively doing a hostile state organ's work, whether it's moving its money, carrying its information, committing violence on its behalf, is graver than just supporting it. It is a kind of treason, and I suspect most British people will call it that as well. So we urge the government to consider making actively working with or receiving material benefit from a higher potential sentence. So Amendment 7 therefore raises that maximum sentence from 14 years to 25, and it's not plucked from the air. It matches the Australian regime under which the IRGC was listed last November. Now, as I said, the government may argue that the 14-year maximum sentence is taken from the NSA 2023. I say let's raise the maximum sentence in both. This is treason, after all, that we are talking about. I turn from where the bill is too soft to where it says nothing at all. Amendment 10, this is one of the first gaps on which the government has offered no answer, and I have looked hard for one. Section 5 of the Terrorism Act 2006 makes preparing an act of terrorism an offence. This bill contains no equivalent. As drafted, a person can plan to assist a designated organ, let's talk about the IRGC to be straightforward, and unless and until they commit the act, they have committed no offence under this bill at all. But the entire purpose of national security work is to prevent and disrupt before harm is done, not to see the plot and clear it up afterwards. We would not tolerate that vulnerability in terrorism law, and we should not invent it here. So Amendment 10 closes that gap and lets police and prosecutors act while a plot is still on the drawing board. But if the Minister believes preparation is already caught elsewhere, I would welcome her showing me where, but I have yet to be shown that in the briefings I've had. Amendment 13, Chair, recognises the gap left by preparation is widened by a second omission, self-directed and inspired actors. The bill misses entirely the person who is never directly commissioned or directed, but who absorbs a hostile state's propaganda and acts on it alone. 20 years of counter-terrorism has taught us this lesson at a terrible cost. The gravest or most likely threat is no longer the directed plot, but the individual radicalised online who acts on their own. Now, hostile states bring the resources, reach and sophistication of states to that propaganda, arguably with a greater inspiring power than any terrorist group can muster. We saw it in the bots that screamed for independence in Scotland and fell silent the moment Iran's internet went down, just as the honourable and gallant member for Tunbridge raised in his speech earlier. And that is just a small insight in the ways that they are invested in turning us against each other. A bill that catches only the commissioned and the directed is fighting the last war and leaving us dangerously exposed to the next. So Amendment 13 captures those inspired to act by a designated body, but not the directly directed by them. I turn now to the most dangerous omission of all, which we've just touched on at the wind-ups, the second reading, which is the omission that would worry our allies and partners, which Amendment 8 seeks to address. As drafted, the bill captures activity in the UK and activity abroad that is prejudicial to the UK. It does not catch activity planned here on British soil to be perpetrated abroad where there is no ability to prove that it is prejudicial to the interests of the UK or may harm the UK. So where there is no harm to the UK. So activity by the RGC in France, Iran, Bosnia, or by the Chinese in Hong Kong may not be directly prejudicial to the interests of the UK. So again, we are adding an unnecessary threshold. But if it is perpetrated here, be it in Manchester or London or anywhere else, we must be able to prosecute those responsible. In plain terms, this gap was turning the UK into a base for state terrorism. A cell here in Britain planning a campaign of intimidation against a journalist in Dublin on behalf of the IRGC, or a network running sabotage operations in Germany, arrested and charged their defence rights itself. The act was not to take place here in the UK, and you cannot argue it was prejudicial to the UK's safety. The law does not like ambiguity. We should not leave prosecutors to have to argue that an attack on Dublin or Berlin was also somehow an attack on London. So Amendment 8 closes that gap directly so that planning hostile activity from British soil is caught wherever that activity is aimed. If the government is confident the scope is already reached, it loses nothing by putting it beyond doubt. Far better to write the law clearly today than to watch a case fall apart on this very point. The next omission is propaganda itself. Since 2006, it's been an offence to disseminate publications that promote terrorism. The bill extends no equivalent protection against the propaganda of designated states. But we've heard colleagues today talk about publications like Press TV that shamefully former members of this House still appear on and are paid to have shows on. Two of the principal weapons of hostile states are the propaganda that recruits and the disinformation that divides. The Chinese Communist Party pushes propaganda and disinformation through the United Front Work Department, and I hope these powers will reach them one day. But Amendment 14 brings designated bodies within the same standard applied to terrorist publications for 20 years, because I do not think in any way that this government thinks that IRGC propaganda should have more latitude than that of the prescribed terrorist group. Next, an omission for many living in our country, especially our Jewish communities, will find most difficult. Under Section 13 of the Terrorism Act 2000, it is an offence to display in public the insignia of a prescribed organisation. It is the power that we rely on to take Hamas flags, Hezbollah banners, the symbols of Hizb ut-Tahrir off our streets. This bill as drafted contains no equivalent provision whatsoever. So if this amendment is not accepted by the government either now or in the other place, the flag of the IRGC may fly lawfully on a British street, glorifying every stabbing, every attack on our Jewish communities, every kidnap plot, every assassination attempt that the regime has directed here. How do we look the people who are being hunted in the eye and tell them the banner of the hunter is welcome on our streets? The government may say that criminalising the display of state symbols brings lawful state activity under UK criminal law, contrary to diplomatic convention, and that by reciprocity, hostile states could criminalise the Union Jack and UK uniforms abroad. I have taken the time to consider this, exposing our personnel and dual nationals. I say yes, state immunity protects foreign states in our courts, but it should not and does not dictate what a resident of this country may do on British pavements. This amendment does not touch the Iranian state, nor its embassy or any accredited diplomat protected by the Vienna Convention. It touches the person waving the flag or wearing the uniform. And the reciprocity argument does not survive 5 seconds contact with reality, because Iran already jails its own citizens for waving the Union Jack. We do not keep our flag safe in Tehran by keeping their flag flying in London. I move from the offences the bill omits to the power it withholds from our police and the officers standing at the border. New Clause 5 closes one of the starkest gaps between this bill and the terrorism law that the Secretary of State has said very clearly she seeks to mirror, the same as was the language she used. If an officer has reasonable grounds to suspect at the border that someone is leaving the United Kingdom to assist a designated terrorist group, which would now be a designated hostile state body, they should be able to seize the passport of the person seeking to travel and stop them. We grant that exact power in terrorism cases. Parliament created it in 2015 so that an officer at the border does not have to watch a suspect board a plane and vanish. On the 29th of March 2024, 2 men stabbed Pouria Zarati, a journalist with Iran International, incredibly brave men who continue to do everything they can to put a light on what is taking place in Iran, outside his home in Wimbledon. The Crown told the court they'd acted as proxies for the Iranian state, and within hours they were at Heathrow and gone. We can close that loophole by accepting this amendment. And Jonathan Hall, KC, the independent review of whom we've spoken much, recommended this power last year. He said it was an immediate recommendation and the government rightly accepted it, and I welcome them having done so. But then they've left it out of the bill. The terrorism equivalent has worked for 10 years. It's been used 75 times. If the threat is visible at the border, we must not tie the hands of the officer standing in front of it. The second power this bill withholds is the Serious Crime Prevention Order. Again, terrorism law already allows it. This bill does not, and that's why I've laid New Clause 6. A serious crime prevention order lets a court manage risk beyond the conviction, limiting travel, restricting internet access, controlling communications, compelling disclosure that aids an investigation. Every one of those tools would help us tackle hostile state networks. We grant them against organised crimes. We grant them against terrorists. But this bill grants them neither against the IRGC or any future designated body. The Minister must therefore explain why an SCPO is right for county lines gangs and for terrorist cells, but not a hostile state. I suspect the real answer that it may have been an omission, or again there may be plans for a future bill, but I say we have this bill now. Let's give them the powers necessary. And that brings me to the blind spot at the centre of this bill. the consequence of writing it for one organisation and forgetting there'll be more state bodies that behave as terrorists. The bill does not mention sanctions once. For legislation whose entire purpose is to act against hostile state bodies, there is a remarkable and revealing silence, because it tells you who it was drafted for. The IRGC is already sanctioned, so the government didn't trouble to build a bridge to the sanctions regime. But the next body we might designate will not be sanctioned or may not be sanctioned at all. And I can assure the House there will be a need for future designations. I've touched on one, the United Front Work Department of the Chinese Communist Party. New Clause 7 enshrines designation as a ground for sanction. Now, it does not impose anything automatic, and it does not ask for a running commentary on sanctions so government lawyers can rest easy, but what it does is give the bill built for a second designation or a third, not just the first. Amendment 15 builds directly on that bridge. Where New Clause 7 makes the link possible, 15 makes the government turn its mind to it. It would require the Secretary of State, within 6 months of designating any body, to consider whether that body should also be sanctioned and to lay the reasons for that decision before this House. This is not a demand that the government sanction anyone, and its demand aside, it is deliberately allows to make sure that designations and sanctions do not drift apart due to inattention. If the government is serious that this power will be used agnostically against bodies not yet sanctioned, they would welcome a discipline that forces it to look every time. I come finally to the threat this bill will not even bring itself to name. Hostile states and the bodies who serve them will use any tool they can to silence dissent, to subvert democracy and to advance their interest, particularly those who sought safety in our country, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, Ukrainians, and also British nationals who've dared to stand up to autocrats and terrorist technocrats who are under now attack on our soil. Amendment 16 names 3 of the most common and most sinister forms of attack by hostile states: transnational repression, abuse of lawfare, and sanctions evasion. It would be the first time that transnational repression was put into British law. That may seem an amazing, glaring omission for many members of this House. I myself was not aware until I started asking the Bill Office when I gave them my amendment to provide for me the legal definition of transnational repression. And they said there isn't one because it's not in law. We can correct that through this bill. It would send a single, unambiguous warning. A foreign power that reaches onto our streets to do these things will be designated for it. We've heard about the threats from Iran to our country. We know how the Chinese Communist Party has put the bounties on the heads of pro-democracy Hong Kongers, cash for the abduction of people as young as 19, kidnap notes put through the doors of neighbours saying, bring this person to the Chinese embassy so we can deal with them. And we've talked about Russia murdering people on our soil. And behind all the names we know, Litvinenko, Berezovsky, all the others, there are hundreds and thousands that we do not, who are still being attacked. Section 33 of the NSA already names some hostile acts: sabotage, the theft of trade secrets, entering prohibited premises. If the Act can name these examples, it can find the room to name transnational repression. And this is the chance to improve the National Security Act and to protect the vulnerables and put autocracies on notice. To conclude, Chair, let me draw these threads together. 13 amendments, every one of them drawn not from theory, but from the body of counter-terrorism law that this country has built, tested and relied upon from 2 decades. Apart from the transnational repression suggestion, everything else is taking actually from terrorism legislation and make sure we don't have omissions or gaps within this bill. It also comes from my experience directly working to counter hostile states before I came to this place and terrorist groups. On even the basics, a propaganda offence, the flags and uniforms, the power to seize a passport at the border, orders we already have, these are the bare minimum the government should be looking to accept. But if these amendments are voted down or not accepted, then it ceases to become an issue of haste and more one of choice. A choice to give the IRGC a gentler regime than the terrorist groups that it funds. We support this bill. We are not trying to stop it. I hope I have made the case clearly that we just want to plug the gaps, and I do not think it is fair for the government to suggest that we are trying to use this like a Christmas tree and hang lots of additional items on it. I'm trying to seek to close existing gaps. The only one that would be new would be transnational repression. I commend these amendments to the committee, and I hope they will be considered.